In this video, I'm going to recap everything that happened in the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG in 2023 so you don't have to. What's potion? You got Matt here, and welcome back to another competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Video. 2023 has come and gone, and with it came some great memories. We've had some pretty bad ones, but overall I think it was a pretty damn good year. So in this video, I'm going to recap everything that happened in the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG in 2023, and hopefully we can all relive some pretty good memories. So if you're excited for the video, then make sure to smash the like button. As always, we're aiming for 150 likes on the video. Also, if you enjoy deck profiles, combo guides, meta discussions, and competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Videos just like this one, you're gonna love this channel. So make sure to subscribe and help us reach our new goal of 5,000 subscribers. With that being said, let's jump into it. Welcome to the 2023 Yu-Gi-Oh! Recap. The January 2023 metagame was a continuation of the end of the 2022 meta, with the Shizu tier limit continuing its tier 0 status as the best deck in the game. YCS Sydney took place on January 7th, and of the top 32 spots, 19 were a Shizu tier limit, 13 of the top 16, as well as 7 of the top 8. Jesse Cotton won YCS Sydney, playing a Shizu tier limit, his 4th YCS win. At this point, all of the Ishizu and tier cards are unlimited, and the deck, while it did rely on successful mills and interacting with your opponent at the right time, it was still incredibly consistent. Other notable decks from YCS Sydney were Fluwanderees because of their ability to main deck Dimension Shifter, which really stopped the Shizu tier's game plan, and because they can get to Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds to force tier to use their normal summon to beat over it. Bright also took up 5 spots on top 32, but was unable to keep up with tier limits. YCS Sydney marked the 5th consecutive Ishizu tier limit win, and players were getting sick of the deck, hoping for a change. Thankfully, a new set would be released in the coming weeks. Amazing Defenders was released on January 20th. This deck building set released 3 new archetypes, Mekanko, Purely, and Rescue Ace. On release, there were mixed feelings about the archetypes as no one knew how good they could be without additional waves of support. Mekanko is an archetype that focuses on powerful equipped spells and monsters that reflect battle damage. Purely was the cute archetype of the set that established a giant boss monster in Expurely Noir. It was the most popular out of the gate because of how cute it was. Rescue Ace was overlooked at first, but with Rescue Ace Hydrant and Turbulence, the bones of a powerful deck was there, but it was definitely lacking something. But little did we know, Amazing Defenders would become one of the most impactful deck building sets of all time. February was a huge month for the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG with multiple product releases, and with that, a change in the metagame. On February 10th, Photon Hypernova, the first core set of the year, was released. This set was an absolute game changer. The most important cards in the set was the second wave of Kashtira cards. Most notably, the Field Spell, Pressured Planet Race-Off, the Pseudo Emergency Teleport in Kashtira Theosis, and the card that would become the most oppressive card of the year in Kashtira Arisar, the boss monster of the archetype. This archetype was meant to counter the Ishizu tier limits meta, and it did a pretty good job of it. Photon Hypernova also introduced the Gold Pride archetype. It would see some success when paired with the Punk engine. Photon Hypernova also released support for branded players in Rinbrum the Striking Dragon and Granganol the Dust Dragon. It also gave us one of the best cards for Labyrinth in Big Welcome Labyrinth. But one of the strongest cards of all time was also released and would see play throughout the rest of 2023. Triple Tactics Thrust would be a searchable way to any normal spell or trap, and eventually would see play in almost every high-level competitive deck. But how would these releases impact YCS Lyon happening the very next day? YCS Lyon took place on February 11th and was the first YCS with Photon Hypernova legal. The top 64 was still primarily tier limits, however it was nowhere near as dominant as it had been in the past. 14 of the top 64 was tier limits, and while it converted well, making up 8 of the top 16, and the finals being a Shizu tier limits mirror, this was a far cry from what was represented at YCS Sydney. With its upgrades, Kashtira was the second most represented deck in the top 64 and top 32. The deck itself was very powerful, but players had yet to come to a consensus on the best play the deck could make. Would it be to zone lock their opponent, playing into cards like Lava Golem, Nibiru, and Kurikara Div Incarnate, or to set up Kashtira Arisar on the 4th summon with back row to protect it and play around the aforementioned blowouts against the strategy? This question would be answered later on in the year. Also on February 11th was a Team YCS in Mexico City. Kashtira and tier limits were both incredibly dominant at this event as well, but tier limits once again took the win, with all 3 players on the winning team playing a Shizu tier. This, however, marked a turning point in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta. Tier limit has now won 7 of the last 8 YCSs. The only one it didn't win was a Latin America remote duel YCS in January. It was time for a change, and that's exactly what we got. On February 6th, the new ban list was announced and would be effective starting February 13th. This list flipped the metagame on its head. It banned Artifact Scythe, Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds, Tearlament Kakalos, and Sprite Elf. It limited Agido the Ancient Sentinel, Kelbeck the Ancient Vanguard, Keldo the Sacred Protector, Mudora the Sword Oracle, Tearlament's Merly, Tearlament's Havnus, Tearlament's Shiren, and Ancient Fairy Dragon due to an errata. And it unlimited Destrudo the Lost Dragon's Prison, Jet Synchron, Mecha Phantom Beast O-Line, Servant of Endymion, True King Lithosygem the Disaster, Yatagarasu, and Spiral Resort. Ishizu tier limit was no more. Losing Kakalos was the most important hit, but the limitations to all the fusion summoning tier names and the Ishizu cards made the deck much more reliant on variants. With the Bestial still being a big part of the meta and Kashtira at full power, tier just couldn't keep up anymore. The banning of Artifact Scythe and Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds were also very welcomed, as they promoted an unhealthy way to play the game. The unlimited section was filled with cards that were remnants of the Crystron Halki Fibrax era. With it banned, these cards could come back. This ban list was very much needed, and its impact was immediate, with a Team YCS in Las Vegas taking place on February 18th. Of the 48 players in top 16, 22 were on Kashtira. It was clearly the best new deck, but there was no consensus on the next best archetypes. Branded, Labyrinth, and Sprite were all vying to be number 2, and while Branded did have the best performance of all these decks, but there was no guarantee it would continue with the rest of the format. On February 24th, the Beware of Traptrick structure deck released. Traptrick became one of, if not the most popular deck at the locals and regional level, and even had some minor success at future YCSs. Overall, February was one of the best months of the year in 2023, mostly because of the ban list. Compared to February, there was almost nothing that happened in March. There was only one YCS this month in Lima on March 11th. Adventure Sprite ended up winning the event, and the finals was actually a mirror match. But what was most impressive was that there were 14 different decks to make top 32 and 7 different decks to make top 8. Kashtira was the most represented, but it didn't have the success that players expected. However, at the regional level, Kashtira continued to dominate the metagame, proving it still was the best deck of the format. On March 10th, a new side set was released, Maze of Memories. This wasn't the most impactful set of the year, but it did provide some very important reprints in Baronne de Fleur, Guardian Chimera, and Psybeast, which was being experimented with in Kashtira. The most important card to come out of this set was Excel Synchro Stardust Dragon, which made Synchro spam decks much more powerful and allowed them to get Baronne on their 5th summon to insulate the deck from Nibiru. April had no new sets released, but it did feature the 250th YCS happening in London, Bogota, and LA all on April 1st. Kashtira's domination was on full display this weekend, winning YCS Bogota and Los Angeles, while Melfi Sprite took first place at YCS London. But that doesn't even tell the whole story. Across all 3 top 32s, 39 of the 96 decks were Kashtira. That's over 40% cash. But the trend continues. There was no clear-cut answer to what was the second best deck of the format behind Kashtira. A few of the best performing decks at this time were Runic Naturia, Branded Despia, Mathmech, and Sprite variants, but none of them could prove they were definitively better than the others. The most important part about this weekend, though, is that across all 3 YCSs, there were over 8,000 participants, marking one of the most successful weekends in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! May 2023 was one of the most anticipated months of the year. There were multiple YCSs and a new core set that could drastically shift the meta, introducing a new contender for best deck of the format. Cyberstorm Access was released on May 5th, 2023, and it introduced a ton of important cards. Purely received its newest wave of support in the form of Pure Lily and Purely Sleepy Memory. These would give the deck an additional monster that was better than the original Purely, and a powerful new quick play spell that would give the deck insane levels of advantage. Purely was now expected to be one of the top 3 to 5 decks of the format. Branded received support in the form of Guiding Quem the Virtuous, Albion the Sanctifier Dragon, and Despian Lulu Lilith. These cards drastically raised the ceiling of what Branded could do, especially Quem, which was the most important new piece of the strategy. The Vanadium archetype finally released, and it was the next piece of the Visas Starfrost lore. It wasn't complete, but it was expected that the deck would become a powerful player in the upcoming meta. Strong individual cards like Bistral Dispatter and Chaos Angel would give Synchro strategies a huge boost, and Sakitama would help propel rank 4 strategies back into the meta. But the most important and hyped cards of the set was the Super Heavy Samurai support. Super Heavy Samurai, Wakoshi, and Motorbike were 1-card combo enablers that allowed players to end on some of the most threatening end wards all while playing around or through many different hand traps. Super Heavy Samurai was expected to be one of the best decks of the format and would get his first chance at YCS Santiago and YCS Philadelphia. YCS Santiago took place on May 20th, and while there isn't a ton of data on it, the main 2 decks were Kashtira and Super Heavy Samurai, with the finals being a Kashtira mirror match. YCS Philly took place the next weekend on May 27th, and it was more of the same. Kashtira dominated, taking 12 of the top 32 in all 4 top 4 spots, eventually winning the event, marking the 4th straight win for Kashtira at a YCS. Super Heavy Samurai would still impress, having the 2nd highest representation in top 64, but it was outperformed by Labyrinth in top cut, with only 1 player making top 8 compared to 2 for Labyrinth. This was surprising because there were only 6 Labyrinth players in the top 64, half the amount of Super Heavy players. It was still early in the deck's life though, and surely nothing would derail this combo deck, and it would eventually become the one true rival to Kashtira, right? Well, during YCS Philadelphia, a new ban list was announced, prompting some of the funniest reactions to the list by content creators, but it would only go into effect in June. June was another packed month in the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG, with multiple set releases and the beginning of the WCQ season, but players were mostly focused on the new ban list that would go into effect on June 5th. Cyberstein, Super Heavy Samurai Scarecrow, number 89 Diablosis the Mind Hacker, Appointer of the Red Lotus, and Branded Expulsion were now banned. Blaster, Dragon Ruler of Infernos, Mathmech Circular, Psyframe Gear Gamma, Denglong First of the Yang Zing, Kashtira Arise Heart, Purely Delicious Memory, and Naturia Sacred Tree were all now limited. Herald of Orange Light, Kashtira Unicorn, Lightning Storm, Runic Fountain, Sky Striker Mobilize Engage, and Sprite Starter were all now semi-limited. And Blackwing Steam the Cloak, Genix Ally Birdman, Samsara Lotus, Spiral Quick Fix, Lyrilusk Recital Starling, Draco Faceoff, and Sky Striker Mecha Modules Multi-Roll were all now unlimited. This list was pretty important, but unfortunately it didn't address the existing Kashtira problem well enough. What it did do though was basically eliminate Super Heavy Samurai from becoming a top tier meta deck. Banning Cyberstein was the right decision, as Super Heavy players would get it onto their field at the end of the long combo and summon out a problematic extra deck monster like Naturia Exterio. With Super Heavy Samurai Scarecrow gone, the deck lost a much needed piece, and while it could still be used as an engine, the deck itself was essentially done. The banning of Branded Expulsion and Diablosis the Mind Hacker were also very important, as they got rid of 2 auto win cards. In their respective decks, Branded and Kashtira, if they resolved, the game was pretty much over. While the ban list was exciting for many players, a new deck building set was also released in June. Wild Survivors was released on June 2nd. It introduced 3 new archetypes: Nouvelle, Vanquished Soul, and Transcendosaurus. This set was more of a meme if anything, as the Nouvelle archetype was essentially just the Hungry Burger archetype, and the new Transcendosaurus cards were exciting for dinosaur players, but didn't do enough for the strategy to see any competitive success. However, Vanquished Soul was extremely hyped as players thought it had potential to be one of the best decks of the year. It was very disappointing though, because 7 of the 10 ultra rare spots were versus cards that need to be played in the deck, making the strategy incredibly expensive. It also had very little success compared to what was anticipated. June had a ton of national championships, and Germany, France, and Italy were the 3 largest. Kashtira ended up winning in Italy and France, and Labyrinth took first place in Germany. At this point, the top decks were starting to become solidified, and it became accepted that Labyrinth was one of the top 2 or 3 best decks this format, along with Kashtira and Sprite variants. On June 23rd, Battles of Legend Monstrous Revenge was released, and while the set was not very impactful to the metagame, it did make quarter century rares much more accessible. However, it did release a card that would eventually be critical to a YCS winner later in the year. The North American Remote Duel YCS was held on June 24th, and while decks like Kashtira, Dragonlink, and Fluandereeze were the most represented in top 16, Exosister won the event, the first time a non-Sprite, Kashtira, or Tearlament deck won a YCS in over 8 months. The question was, would that continue as we moved on to the second half of the year? As the World Championship qualifier season continued, the meta continued to evolve around Kashtira, with it being the clear-cut most represented deck at these events. On July 1st was the European World Championship qualifier, which had a very diverse top 16, with 10 different strategies making it that far. But the biggest surprise was seeing Rickus and Avalon upset Kashtira en route to taking first place, led by Jessica Robinson. This deck was almost non-existent in North America, but was one of the biggest threats in Europe and was arguably the best combo deck of the format. The North American WCQ was on July 8th, and while there were surprises in Europe, North America was pretty standard, with 9 of the top 16 being held by Kashtira, and the entire top 4 as well. Jeremy Mitchell ended up winning the event, but one thing that is clear is that Purely is starting to make a name for itself, being one of only 2 non-Kashtira decks to make top 8s. On July 28th, Duelist Nexus, the newest core set, was released. This set was expected to be lackluster, only having a few very strong meta cards. The main card everyone was after was Revolution Synchron, as was expected to take combo decks to the next level, but there were many other cards released to support existing archetypes. Purely received a Purely Noir, Infernoble received Charles the Great and more, Runic, Dark World, and Vanadium also received some great new cards. Rescue Ace also received their most powerful support to date in Preventer and Emergency, a solid piece of interruption and an E-Telly for the strategy. But there were 2 archetypes that became almost instant powerhouses. The new Chimera archetype was released and in combination with Branded became one of the best and most popular strategies. But under everyone's nose was a deck that would shock the community and become the new best deck of the format, but we'll talk about that a bit later. The 2023 World Championship took place on August 5th and used a joint banlist between the TCG and OCG. Due to the OCG's banlist at the time, Kashtira was unplayable. Many wondered what the top deck would be, but it was a popular opinion that Rickus and Avalon would win the event as it was unhit on both banlists. And by the time we got to top 8, there were 2 apiece of Dragonlink, Ricka, and Mathmech, with Sword Soul and Vanquished Soul being the final 2 decks. The finals were Sword Soul and Dragonlink, 2 decks that had not won a YCS in the TCG in almost 20 months at this point. When the dust settled, Paulie Aronson on Dragonlink won the 2023 World Championship. The deck was extremely strong, and thanks to the release of the Bestials and the release of Bestial Despater, it had enough extenders to play through Interruption. Even though the deck won the World Championship, there were doubts that the deck would perform as well in the TCG, because Kashtira Arisar's Macrocosmos effect made it very difficult for the deck to play. On August 11th, Legendary Duelist Soul Burning Volcano was released. It gave support to the Salamangreat, Balan Boxer, and Volcanic archetypes. The set itself was not very interesting to many players because it had no real competitive impact. However, Salamangreat of Fire was expected to do great things if Salamangreat Gazelle was ever taken off the banlist. With the World Championship coming to a close, a new competitive season began, and a Team YCS in Sao Paulo was the first big event on September 2nd. This event was critical for competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! For the rest of the year because in a shocking turn of event, a deck with very little hype came out and was the second most represented deck in the top 16 and was a part of the winning Trios team. Unchained was back and became one of the most feared decks of this format. It took up 8 of the 24 decks playing in the top 8, more than double any other deck. Team Better Have It won the event with a combination of Bestial, Dragonlink, Purely, and Unchained, marking the first YCS win for each of these 3 decks. Sao Paulo was the stepping stone to Unchained becoming the true rival to Kashtira, and when YCS Vancouver came around on September 9th, Unchained proved how dominant it was. There were 5 Unchained players in top 8, 3 in the top 4, and the finals was a mirror match. The winner of YCS Vancouver was Jesse Cotton, winning his 2nd YCS of the year and 5th overall. One of the strangest trends to come out of YCS Vancouver was the emergence of Marionette Might. This card was incredibly strong in the Unchained matchup and became very popular. This format saw the most playability of Triple Tactics Thrust in Unchained, as it could act as an interruption or as a starter. Even the effect to set a spell or trap could be valuable as it would get the engine online. But why was Unchained so good? Well, Unchained received support in July in Duelist Nexus. The archetype went under the radar, but thanks to the release of powerful cards like Unchained Soul Lord of Yama, Sharvara, and Chayama, the deck was now able to take more advantage of their destruction effects and was one of the most difficult decks to beat in a resource game, but it wasn't unbeatable. YCS Cancun was a week after Vancouver on September 16th. At this point, players had learned how to play against Unchained more, and it wasn't able to replicate the same success it had earlier this month. The top 8 was 3 Kashtira, 3 Unchained, 1 Rescue Ace, and 1 Fluandereeze. And in a shock to everyone, the top 2 was Fluwandereeze and Rescue Ace, with Flu taking home its first ever solo YCS win. Rescue Ace was right there though, and at this point, players knew what was coming in the next few weeks, which would eventually turn Rescue Ace into an absolute powerhouse. The Megatins also released this month, and while there were no new cards, they did reprint some powerful staples, including Kashtira Fenrir, the Bestials, the Adventure Engine, the Runic cards, and the Labyrinth Core. This wouldn't impact the meta, but it did give accessible reprints to players who needed them. The Crimson King structure deck was released on September 22nd. This was the second structure deck of the year, and it had big shoes to fill considering Traptrix was a solid meta option at the time of its release. It didn't do as well as Traptrix, but it did release Vision Resonator and Crimson Gaia, which would see some play as a small engine later on in the year. On September 15th, a new ban list was announced. It would come into effect on September 25th, and while it was a small list, it had a huge impact. Kashtira Arise Heart was finally banned, while Bestial Magnamut and Chaos Space were now limited, and Herald of Orange Light and Salamangreat Gazelle were now unlimited. Arise Heart's banning opened the door to so many more decks becoming playable, and it was a much needed change for the game. Bestial Magnamut was too generic and strong, so it's not a surprise it was hit to 1, but the community was shocked to see Chaos Space get limited. The theory is that after winning Worlds, the deck needed to be hit in some capacity, and losing 2 Chaos Space and 2 Magnamut definitely did that. Meanwhile, Salamangreat Gazelle's freedom coincided nicely with the release of the Soul Burning Volcano side set and allowed Sala to become a solid rogue option. And finally, on September 30th was YCS Dortmund. With the banning of Kashtira, tier limits came rushing back into the metagame, taking up 9 of the top 32 spots, more than double any other deck except for Unchained, which had 6. The format was still very diverse, with 10 different decks making up top 16 and 7 different decks making up top 8. The finals were Rickus and Avalon versus Vanquished Soul, and Ricka won. This showed us its performance in the WCQ season was no fluke, and it definitely was a threatening deck. While Unchained, Purely, and Tier Limits were fighting for best deck in the world status, Age of Overlord was almost here, and it was expecting to change the game. Age of Overlord was released on October 20th, and it was the final core set of 2023. This set was one of the most impactful in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh!, releasing the Sinful Spoils engine, the Horus engine, support for Vanadium, Chimera, Labyrinth, and more, and it released 2 of the most powerful standalone cards of the year in Superstar Slayer Typhon Sky Crisis and SP Little Knight. While Typhon was good, it had nothing compared to SP Little Knight, which had an argument for being the best card of the year. This card would drastically change how Yu-Gi-Oh! Was played for the rest of the year, while the Sinful Spoils engine would take Rescue Ace and blast into Tier 1 status, and the Horus engine paired with Tier Limits would bring them back into the metagame. The very next day after Age of Overlord's release was YCS Indianapolis on October 21st. This tournament was Rescue Ace's coming out party, with 12 of the top 32 spots being held by Sinful Spoils Rescue Ace. The next highest representation was Purely with 4 spots. The finals were a Rescue Ace mirror, with Steven Santoli taking first place, his second YCS win of the year. With the Sinful Spoils engine, Rescue Ace was not only able to create its powerful Turbulence play, but they could also protect it from Impermanent Veiler by getting access to either Barone or Borreload Savage Dragon via Jet Synchron, or by link climbing into the Firewall Dragon Terrorist package to set up negates. It was obvious that Sinful Spoils Rescue Ace was the new best deck of the format, and that Unchained short time as the best deck had come to an end. 1 week later was YCS Santa Cruz, and while this wasn't the largest event by any means, it's notable because the winning deck was Sinful Spoils Mikanko, which means that every single deck from Amazing Defenders the first set of the year has now won a YCS. November wasn't the busiest month this year, but it did release one of the most popular sets of all time in the 25th anniversary Rarity Collection. There were no new cards released, but this set was without a doubt the best product Konami has released in ages, giving increased rarity versions and easily accessible copies of some of the game's best cards, including Baron de Fleur, Pot of Prosperity, Forbidden Droplets, and more. YCS Richmond was on November 4th, and Unchained took first place, but Infernal Night was the biggest story, with 3 players making top 16 and 1 even made top 4. This was unexpected, as even with the new support it received, it was thought of as being less powerful than decks like Rescue Ace and Purely, but it was able to do better than them at this event. Valiant Smashers released 3 new archetypes, Centurion, Memento Clan, and Valmonica. None of these 3 archetypes were expected to be meta-defining, but Centurion did have potential as a tier 2 deck because of its ability to play a lot of non-engine, while still Hot Red Dragon Archfiend King Calamity locking players. Compared to the previous sets released in Age of Overlord and Rarity Collection, this set fell on its face. On December 8th, the highly anticipated Fire King structure deck was released. This deck was expected to have an immediate impact on the meta even before becoming full power. The OCG taught us that this deck would be a huge threat, and they were right, especially when paired with a Sinful Spoils engine. Fire King's first competitive event would be YCS Bologna on December 9th. While it wasn't the best fire-based deck in the tournament, Fire King was still able to claim 4 spots in the top 64, but the event was dominated by Rescue Ace, Labyrinth, and Tier Limits, which had 7, 6, and 5 top 32 spots respectively. However, while these 3 decks did perform well, the winner of the event was completely out of left field. Joshua Schmidt took home first place on Bestial Runic, the only one in top 64 on that deck. The deck used the Runic card for interruptions and to get bodies on the board for powerful level 10 synchros, while constantly recycling resources. It also played Duality, which came out in Battles of Legend, Monsters Revenge, and was critical to the deck's success. Centurion also topped for the first time, but Unchained fell off with only 1 player making top 32. In general, this year saw the rise and fall of one of the strongest decks in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Had 3 pretty good ban lists, some decent product releases, and have set up Yu-Gi-Oh! For success in 2024. Well, there it is, the 2023 Yu-Gi-Oh! Recap. If you enjoyed the video, it would be amazing if you guys left a like on the video, and let me know down in the comments below what was your absolute favorite part of Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2023. Also, if you made it this far in the video, you must have enjoyed it even just a little bit. So make sure to subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. We are on our road to 5,000 subscribers and we cannot get there without your help. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and I'll see you all next time.